5 manila folders stacked on the podium were the only warning Ilhan Omar received before the ambush began. The moderator's pleasantries died in his throat as Ben Shapiro bypassed opening statements entirely, launching a direct strike at the Congresswoman's financial vulnerabilities. The air in the University of Minnesota auditorium electrified instantly as Shapiro demanded a specific number regarding the millions of dollars flowed from donor coffers into the bank accounts of Omar's husband's consulting firm. There was no preamble, no polite political discourse. It was an immediate data-driven interrogation under the glare of national television cameras, leaving Omar visibly scrambling for a foothold before the debate had officially started. Congresswoman Omar, how much money did your campaign pay your husband's company? Ben Shapiro's voice cut through the packed University of Minnesota auditorium before the moderator could finish introducing the debate rules. 2,000 people went silent. CNN's cameras swiveled to capture Ilhan Omar's face. She blinked, caught off guard. Simple question. How much campaign money went to Tim Mynet's firm, E Street Group, during the 2020 re-election? Shapiro stood behind his podium, 5 manila folders stacked in front of him, his expression flat and clinical. The moderator tried to intervene regarding the schedule, but the interruption was ignored. It was a number. Federal Election Commission reports are public record. Did she know the number or should he tell her? Omar recovered slightly, her voice tightening as she insisted her husband's firm provided legitimate consulting services. That was not the question. How much money? Yes or no? Do you know the amount? The audience leaned forward. Half had come to cheer Shapiro. Half had come to support Omar. Now, everyone just wanted to hear her answer. The University of Minnesota auditorium was a powder keg waiting for a match. And Ben Shapiro lit it within seconds of taking the stage. Ignoring the moderator's attempts to establish procedural norms, Shapiro launched a forensic assault on Ilhan Omar's campaign finances, specifically targeting the massive payments made to the E Street Group, the firm owned by her husband, Tim Mynet. Omar, visibly unsettled by the immediate deviation from standard debate protocol, attempted to deflect with generalized assurances about legitimate consulting services. Her attempt to blur the lines was met with cold, hard data. Shapiro did not want vague descriptions of voter outreach, he wanted acknowledgement of the number. When she hesitated, he provided it for her, projecting the Federal Election Commission reports onto the massive overhead screens. The figure $2.783.000 glowed in unforgiving yellow highlight. The audience, split between ardent supporters and equally passionate detractors, leaned in as Shapiro framed the expenditure not just as a large sum, but as a potential mechanism for funneling donor money into personal household income. He relentlessly hammered the point that these millions were paid to her spouse's firm for categories so broad, digital consulting, strategic consulting, research, as to be meaningless without specific deliverables, none of which Omar could readily identify under pressure. The questioning shifted from the sheer volume of cash to the legality of her operation. Shapiro produced the findings of the Minnesota Campaign Finance and Public Disclosure Board, which had previously ruled that Omar violated state campaign finance law, ordering personal reimbursements to her campaign. Omar's attempts to characterize these violations as minor accounting errors were steamrolled by Shapiro's adherence to the board's specific language of legal violation. The interrogation deepened, connecting the massive campaign payments to Mynet's troubled history and other business ventures, including civil lawsuits alleging the mishandling of investor funds in cannabis and winery projects. Shapiro's argument was a pincer movement, questioning the ethics of enriching a spouse with donor funds while simultaneously highlighting that spouse's questionable financial track record. Every pause Omar took to calibrate her response was filled with more rapid-fire data points, painting a picture of a campaign treated as a personal piggy bank, shielded only by generalized cries of bigotry whenever the accounting was questioned. The segment ended not with a satisfactory answer from the Congresswoman, but with Shapiro closing the first financial folder and ominously reaching for the second, signaling that the night's dissection of her record was only just beginning. The sterile, conditioned air of the University of Minnesota auditorium seemed to drop several degrees as Ben Shapiro deliberately closed the first manila folder. The sharp snap of the cardstock echoed through the microphone, signaling a definitive end to the discussion on finances. While the audience was still processing the dizzying array of numbers, the $2.8 million, the tax returns, the campaign finance violations, Shapiro was already moving the battlefield to terrain that was far more volatile and infinitely more personal. He reached for the second folder. This movement was not hurried, it was executed with a predator's patience. He placed it squarely on the podium, allowing the camera operators to zoom in on the label printed in bold, accusatory font. Anti-Semitism, a pattern. The murmur that had rippled through the crowd during the financial segment died out instantly. Money was politics. Corruption was common. But this was an accusation that touched the third rail of American discourse. The silence in the room became heavy, a physical weight pressing down on the 2,000 attendees. Shapiro looked up, his gaze bypassing the moderator and locking directly onto Congresswoman Omar. He did not begin with a question. Instead, he signaled the audiovisual team. The massive overhead screens, which moments ago had displayed dry spreadsheets, flickered and transformed. A chronological timeline appeared, stretching across the digital canvas, marked with dates, tweets, and pull quotes. It was a visual indictment of a worldview. He began his interrogation not with anger, but with a chilling, clinical precision. He announced to the room that he would deviate from the standard political practice of paraphrasing. Tonight, there would be no interpretations of the Congresswoman's words. There would only be the words themselves, stripped of spin, laid bare for examination. The timeline zoomed in on the first entry, February 2012. The text of the tweet loomed large, white letters against a stark black background. Israel has hypnotized the world. May Allah awaken the people and help them see the evil doings of Israel. Shapiro let the audience read it. He let them absorb the specific vocabulary before he began his dissection. When he spoke, his voice was surgical. He zeroed in on the word, hypnotized. He turned to the audience, explaining the etymology of hate. This was not the language of geopolitical critique. He argued, one does not accuse a government of hypnotizing the UN Security Council regarding border disputes. The imagery of hypnosis, of magical, sinister mind control, was an ancient trope, ripped from the pages of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and the darkest propaganda of 1930s Europe. It invoked the conspiracy that a small, secret cabal of Jews possessed the supernatural power to manipulate the minds of the Gentile world, to puppet master global events against the will of the masses. Omar shifted behind her podium, her composure showing its first hairline fractures. She attempted to interject, her voice tight, claiming that these words were from a long time ago, a reaction to a specific conflict, a metaphor for the fog of war. But Shapiro was relentless. He cut off her retreat by expanding the scope of the inquiry. He demanded a comparative analysis. If hypnotized was merely a figure of speech for effective lobbying or state propaganda, where were the other examples? He rattled off a list of regimes Omar had criticized in the past. Saudi Arabia, a theocratic monarchy. China, with its surveillance state. Russia, with its aggressive expansionism. Had she ever accused the Saudis of casting a spell over Washington? Had she ever tweeted that the Chinese Communist Party had hypnotized the West? The rhetorical trap snapped shut. The absence of such language for any other nation revealed that the vocabulary of mind control was reserved exclusively for the Jewish state. It was not a policy critique, it was a specific, targeted pathology. The screen shifted. The timeline advanced to February 2019. The infamous exchange with journalist Glenn Greenwald regarding congressional support for Israel. The tweet that had ignited a firestorm appeared. It's all about the Benjamins, baby. The reference to the $100 bill. The slang for cash. The casual dismissal of strategic alliance in favor of bribery. Shapiro walked the audience through the implication. When asked who was paying these Benjamins, Omar had replied with a single word, IPAC. Shapiro's analysis here was blistering. He accused her of reviving the age-old slur that Jewish money buys national sovereignty. He dismantled her subsequent apology, a statement claiming she was learning about the painful history of anti-Semitic tropes, with scathing skepticism. He addressed the audience, asking them to suspend their disbelief. Was it credible? He asked. That a sitting United States Congresswoman, a woman of deep intelligence and education, a graduate of North Dakota State University, had managed to reach the age of 37 without knowing that accusing Jews of using money to control governments was offensive? He argued that her apology was not an act of contrition, but a tactical maneuver, a get-out-of-jail-free card played to survive the news cycle so she could return to the behavior later. He characterized it as a cycle of abuse, offend, claim ignorance, apologize, and repeat. The Benjamin's tweet was not a slip of the tongue. It was a window into how she believed the world actually worked, that Jewish influence was illegitimate, purchased, and subversive. But Shapiro was not done. The prosecution moved to March 2019. To a bookstore in Washington, D.C. Busboys and Poets. The transcript appeared on the screen, documenting her speech where she questioned the allegiance to a foreign country, held by advocates for Israel. Shapiro stepped out from behind the podium, closing the physical distance to the audience to emphasize the gravity of this charge. He spoke as an Orthodox Jew, his voice vibrating with personal intensity. This, he explained, was the dual loyalty charge. This was the accusation that had justified the imprisonment of Alfred Dreyfus in France. This was the lie that Stalin used to purge Jewish doctors. This was the pretext used for centuries to strip Jews of citizenship, to frame them as the eternal other, the guests who could never be trusted because their hearts belonged to a foreign power. By accusing American supporters of Israel of allegiance to a foreign country, Shapiro argued, Omar was not debating foreign policy. She was questioning their patriotism. She was defining Jewish Americans as a fifth column, a subversive element within the body politic. Omar attempted to pivot to her standard defense, the shield of identity. She spoke of her own marginalization, her diverse staff, her Jewish friends. She tried to frame the criticism as a bad faith attack from right-wing agitators. Shapiro had anticipated this exact deflection. He reached into the folder and pulled out a stack of papers, printed on heavy stock. He held them up, not for the cameras, but for her. These were not quotes from Fox News or Donald Trump. These were the verdicts of her own party. He read the condemnations into the record, turning her own allies against her. He quoted Representative Eliot Engel, the Democratic chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, who called her Benjamin's comment a vile anti-Semitic slur. He quoted Representative Ted Deutsch, who spoke of the pain of hearing such language from a colleague. He quoted Representative Max Rose, a Jewish combat veteran and a Democrat, who said her questioning of loyalty was deeply hurtful. The coup de grace was the slide showing House Resolution 183. Shapiro reminded the room that this resolution, condemning anti-Semitism, was passed specifically because of her. It was a historic rebuke. Even Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House who famously protected her caucus, had been forced to issue a statement condemning Omar's use of anti-Semitic tropes and prejudicial accusations. Shapiro painted a picture of complete isolation. It wasn't Republicans attacking her, it was the entire American political establishment, left and right, recoiling from her rhetoric. He highlighted the culmination of this pattern, February 2023. The vote to remove her from the Foreign Affairs Committee. The screen displayed the vote tally, 218 to 211. But Shapiro focused on the qualitative, not the quantitative. He noted that while the vote was partisan, the sentiment was not. He argued that she lost her seat not because of her identity, but because her worldview was fundamentally incompatible with the nuances of foreign diplomacy. A diplomat cannot view the world through the lens of conspiracy theories. A member of the Foreign Affairs Committee cannot believe that allies are hypnotizing the world or that support is bought with Benjamins. He closed the folder, the sound echoing in the silent auditorium. He summarized the case with a devastating finality. 3 separate incidents, 3 separate apologies, a removal from a committee, a rebuke from the Speaker of the House. Congresswoman, Shapiro said, his voice dropping to a register that commanded absolute attention. At what point do we stop calling these mistakes and start recognizing them as your actual beliefs? You do not accidentally stumble into the protocols of the elders of Zion. You do not accidentally accuse your colleagues of dual loyalty. You do not accidentally equate democracies with terrorists. You do it because you believe it. And tonight, The record shows that your beliefs are not just radical, they are hateful." The camera lingered on Omar's face. For the first time that night, the practiced look of defiant bemusement was gone. In its place was something else. The realization that the shield of identity politics had been shattered by the hammer of her own words. The audience, usually quick to break into partisan cheering sections, remained silent, weighing the sheer volume of the evidence that had just been presented. The pattern Shapiro had promised was no longer a political talking point, it was an undeniable, documented reality hanging over the stage. The silence that followed the dissection of the antisemitism dossier was not the quiet of peace. It was the vacuum of a room that had been sucked dry of oxygen. Ben Shapiro did not allow the atmosphere to repressurize. He did not drink water. He did not shuffle his papers. He simply moved his hand to the third manila folder. A movement that had taken on the ominous quality of a judge reaching for a gavel. The label on this file was invisible to the back rows, but its contents were etched into the collective trauma of the American psyche. Shapiro signaled the control booth with a sharp nod. The overhead screens, still glowing with the remnants of the Benjamin's tweet, cut to black, then flared to life with video footage. The date stamp in the corner read March 23, 2019. The setting was a banquet hall. The logo of the Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE, prominent in the background. Ilhan Omar stood at the podium in the video, gesturing with the fluid confidence of a rising star addressing her base. Her voice, amplified by the auditorium's sound system, filled the tense air of the University of Minnesota. CARE was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something and that all of us were starting to lose access to our civil liberties. Shapiro let the clip play a second time, then a third. He wanted the phrase to settle into the marrow of the audience. He raised his hand, and the video froze on Omar's face. The silence returned, but this time it was brittle, fragile. Some people did something. Shapiro repeated the phrase slowly, stripping it of its cadence, leaving only the raw, grammatical skeleton. He turned to the congresswoman, his expression hardening from clinical detachment to a controlled, searing intensity. He began to deconstruct the sentence not as a linguist, but as a prosecutor. The phrase, "some people," he argued, was an act of deliberate anonymization. It stripped the 19 hijackers of their identity, their ideology, and their intent. It reduced the soldiers of al-Qaeda to vague, shapeless actors. And then, the predicate, did something. Shapiro leaned over the podium. Did something, he echoed, his voice dripping with disdain. He posited that one might say a child did something when they spilled milk. One might say a neighbor did something when they made a noise complaint. But to use that phrase to describe the systematic incineration of nearly 3,000 human beings was not merely a poor choice of words, it was a moral obscenity. He began a reconstruction of that Tuesday morning in September, painting a verbal mural of the horror that Omar's language had obscured. He described the clear, cobalt blue of the New York sky before the first plane hit. He spoke of the sensory overload of the event, the smell of jet fuel that choked lower Manhattan for weeks, the sound of bodies hitting the atrium roof which first responders initially mistook for falling debris. He forced the audience to confront the specific realities of the day. The flight attendants whose throats were slashed before impact. The office workers on the upper floors who were faced with the impossible choice between burning to death or jumping into the void. He recounted the collapse of the South Tower, the cloud of pulverized concrete and human remains that chased New Yorkers down the streets. The firefighters who rushed up stairwells knowing they were climbing into their own tombs. He listed the casualty count, 2.977 dead. Thousands more dying slowly from toxic dust exposure in the years that followed. An entire generation traumatized, a geopolitical era defined by the loss. And against this backdrop of apocalyptic destruction, he juxtaposed her 6 words again, "some people did something." The contrast was physically jarring. Omar, gripping the sides of her lectern, attempted to intervene. She began to speak of the context, of the civil rights abuses that Muslim Americans faced in the wake of the attacks, of the Patriot Act, of the surveillance state. She argued that her speech was about the resilience of her community, not a historical analysis of the attack itself. But Shapiro was waiting for this defense. He cut through her explanation with a sharp rebuke. He acknowledged that civil liberties were a valid topic of debate. One could discuss the Patriot Act. One could discuss surveillance. But, he thundered, one does not need to sanitize the massacre of Americans to defend the rights of Muslims. The two were not mutually exclusive. He challenged her to find any other historical atrocity she would describe with such passive, dismissive language. Would she describe the Holocaust as some people doing something? Would she describe the Rwandan genocide or the slave trade with such vague trivialities? The rhetorical trap was inescapable. By sanitizing the language of 9/11, Shapiro argued, she revealed a subconscious hierarchy of sympathy. In her worldview, the terrorists were vague actors. Their crimes minimized to something, while the American response was the true crime, the true source of specific, detailed grievance. To drive the point from the abstract to the visceral, Shapiro reached into the folder and produced a single photograph. He held it up. It was not a picture of the smoking ruins. It was a portrait of a young man, smiling, full of life. "This is James Cartier," Shapiro said, his voice dropping to a hush that carried to the back of the hall. He was 26 years old. He was an electrician. He was working on the 105th floor of the South Tower. Shapiro told James's story. He described the phone calls James made to his sister and his brother as the smoke filled the room. He described the terror in a young man's voice as he realized he was going to die. He described the fact that James's body was never fully recovered, that his family was left with only fragments and memories. He turned the photo toward Omar. James Cartier was not the victim of some people doing something, Shapiro declared, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. He was murdered by Islamic terrorists. He was slaughtered by men who hated America and everything it stands for. And when you describe his murder as something, you are not just insulting his memory, you are spitting on his grave. He demanded she say the words. He challenged her to look at the photo of James Cartier and say, "Islamic terrorists murdered this man." The audience watched, breathless. Omar stood frozen, caught between the political toxicity of complying with Shapiro's demand and the moral toxicity of refusing it. She offered a generalized condemnation of all terrorism, a retreat into safe, broad language. Shapiro shook his head, placing the photo back on the podium with reverence. "You can't say it," he noted. "You can't say the specific words because to name the ideology is to violate the narrative you've built." But he did not stop at 9/11. The folder contained more. Shapiro widened the aperture, moving from the past to the present, from domestic tragedy to foreign policy. He signaled for the next slide. A tweet from June 2021 appeared. "We must have the same level of accountability and justice for all victims of crimes against humanity. We have seen unthinkable atrocities committed by the US, Hamas, Israel, Afghanistan, and the Taliban." The unthinkable atrocities tweet. Shapiro read it aloud, emphasizing the grouping, the United States and Israel, two democracies, listed in the same breath. In the same sentence. In the same moral category as Hamas and the Taliban. Shapiro dissected this equivalence with the precision of a philosopher. He defined the entities she had conflated. Hamas, a designated terrorist organization whose charter explicitly calls for the genocide of Jews, which uses its own civilians as human shields, which executes homosexuals and political dissidents. The Taliban, a theocratic regime that forbids women from attending school, that stones adulterers, that harbored al-Qaeda. And on the other side, the United States and Israel. Imperfect democracies, yes, but nations with independent judiciaries, with free presses, with rules of engagement, with mechanisms for accountability. Nations where soldiers who commit crimes are court-martialed, not celebrated in the streets. He accused Omar of moral insanity. He argued that putting these groups in the same bucket was not a call for justice. It was an act of intellectual vandalism. It suggested that there was no difference between the firefighter and the arsonist, provided they both used fire. Once again, he did not rely solely on his own condemnation. He brought up the receipts from her own party. The screen flashed a statement led by Congressman Brad Schneider and signed by 11 other Jewish Democrats. The text was damning. Equating the United States and Israel to Hamas and the Taliban is as offensive as it is misguided. ignoring the differences between democracies governed by the rule of law and contemptible terrorist groups ferments prejudice. Shapiro pointed to the screen. Your own colleagues called this prejudice. He said, 12 Democrats looked at your worldview and saw it for what it was. A degradation of the very concept of democracy. He then pivoted to her voting record to prove that this was not just about tweets, it was about policy. He brought up the vote on the Armenian genocide. The House had voted overwhelmingly to recognize the systematic slaughter of 1.5 million Armenians by the Ottoman Empire. It was a vote of historical conscience. You voted present, Shapiro noted, the scorecard appearing on the screen. Not yes, not no, present. He explained the geopolitics. Turkey, the successor state to the Ottoman Empire, vehemently denies the genocide. Turkey is also an Islamist power, often at odds with the West. Shapiro asked the question that hung in the air. Why would Ilhan Omar, a self-proclaimed champion of human rights, refuse to acknowledge a genocide? Was it because the perpetrators were the Ottoman Empire? Was it because she did not want to offend President Erdogan of Turkey? He contrasted this with her eagerness to sanction Israel. When the Jewish state defended itself, she called for boycotts. When the Ottoman Empire committed genocide, she voted present. When Iran, the world's leading state sponsor of terror, shot down American drones or funded Hezbollah, she called for de-escalation. When America killed the terrorist General Qasem Soleimani, she claimed it was a war crime. Shapiro synthesized these data points into a devastating profile. He described a hierarchy of sympathy that governed her actions. In this hierarchy, Western democracies were always the aggressors, always the villains, always the ones who needed to be restrained. Meanwhile, terrorist organizations and anti-Western regimes were treated as victims of circumstance. Their crimes contextualized, their atrocities minimized, their motives understood. This is the pattern, Shapiro concluded, closing the third folder. You minimize the murder of Americans on 9/11. You equate our military with the Taliban. You refuse to recognize genocides when it's politically inconvenient for your allies. But you weaponize human rights language against the only democracy in the Middle East. He looked at her, his expression devoid of the earlier sarcasm, replaced by cold, hard judgment. The problem, Congresswoman, is not that you criticize America. Criticism is patriotic. The problem is that when you look at the United States and you look at the Taliban, you are genuinely confused about who the bad guys are. The audience in the auditorium sat in a stunned stupor. The emotional whiplash, from the heartbreaking story of James Cartier to the cold geopolitical analysis of her voting record, had left the room drained. There were no cheers now, even from Shapiro's supporters. The gravity of the accusations was too heavy for applause. Omar stood at her podium, isolated in the spotlight, having been stripped of the moral high ground she so often claimed. The "some people did something" clip played on a loop in the minds of the voters, forever tethered to the image of the falling towers and the smiling face of a man who never came home. And Ben Shapiro, sensing the total shift in the room's energy, reached for the fourth folder, ready to pivot from her public failures to her private secrets. The emotional resonance of the 9/11 discussion still hung heavy in the air. A thick fog of solemnity that dampened the usual partisan energy of the room. But Ben Shapiro was not interested in maintaining a mood, he was interested in building a case. He closed the terrorism folder with a decisive thud, a sound that marked the end of the ideological examination and the beginning of the legal one. He placed his hand on the fourth file. It was thicker than the others, bulging with documents that bore the dense, unglamorous topography of government bureaucracy. Shapiro introduced the next subject with a warning. The previous topics, money, anti-Semitism, terrorism, were matters of public record and public debate. They were controversial, yes, but they were political. What was inside this folder, he announced, was different. These were not just political liabilities, they were potential felonies. He opened the file, and the label was revealed to the cameras in stark black and white: immigration, marriage, and fraud. The auditorium shifted uneasily. This was the rumor that had shadowed Ilhan Omar for years. The conspiracy theory that mainstream outlets had largely dismissed as too tabloid, too invasive, or too complex to litigate. Shapiro, however, treated it not as a tabloid scandal, but as a forensic puzzle. He signaled the control booth, and the screens behind him transformed into a complex, multicolored graphic. Shapiro stepped away from the podium, using a laser pointer to guide the audience through the labyrinth of dates and names that appeared on the digital display. He began with the faith-based marriage to Ahmed Hirsi in 2002. He explained the distinction carefully. In the eyes of the mosque, they were married; in the eyes of the United States government and the IRS, they were single. They had 2 children. They lived together. Then, the pointer moved to 2008. A separation, a split. And then, the pivotal year, 2009. The pointer landed on a new name, Ahmed Nur Said Elmi. Shapiro's voice took on the cadence of a detective laying out the timeline of a crime. He noted that in 2009, Ilhan Omar legally married Ahmed Nur Said Elmi. This was not a faith-based union, this was a civil marriage. Licensed by the state, recognized by the federal government. Elmi was a British citizen. By marrying an American citizen, he gained a pathway to United States residency. So far, Shapiro conceded, this could be described as a whirlwind romance, a rebound marriage, a mistake, but then he moved the pointer to the years that followed, and the narrative of a romantic mistake began to disintegrate under the weight of the data. The timeline showed that in 2011, Elmi obtained his U.S. permanent residency status based on his marriage to Omar. But simultaneously, the timeline showed something else. It tracked Ilhan Omar's address, her social media posts, and court records from unrelated minor infractions. Every single data point placed her not with her new legal husband, Elmi, but with her ex-partner, Ahmed Hirsi. Shapiro turned to the audience, his expression incredulous. He described the scenario. A woman marries a British man. That man gets a green card. But the woman never lives with him. Instead, she continues to live with, have a 3rd child with, and publicly present herself as the partner of the man she supposedly left. Shapiro asked the question that was screaming from the data: if the marriage to Elmi was genuine, why was she living with Hirsi? And if she was living with Hirsi, why was she legally married to Elmi? The implication was clear, though Shapiro did not say the word yet. He let the audience do the math. A sham marriage, an immigration fraud scheme designed to bypass the difficult, years-long process of legal immigration for a British national. But Shapiro knew that speculation was not evidence. He needed a smoking gun. He returned to the podium and pulled a document from the folder. It was a redacted tax return transcript. He signaled for the next slide. The screen displayed a blown-up image of a 2014 joint tax return. Shapiro circled the filing status with his laser pointer. Married filing jointly. He circled the names, Ilhan Omar and Ahmed Hirsi. He then pointed back to the marriage timeline. In 2014, Ilhan Omar was still legally married to Ahmed Nur Said Elmi. She would not divorce Elmi until 2017. The room went deadly silent. Shapiro explained the law with brutal simplicity. You cannot file a joint federal tax return with someone who is not your legal spouse. To do so is to sign a federal document under penalty of perjury declaring a falsehood. In 2014 and 2015, while legally married to Elmi, Omar had filed jointly with Hirsi. This is not a clerical error, Shapiro stated, his voice ringing with authority. This is tax fraud. This is perjury. You signed your name to a federal document claiming to be married to one man while you were legally married to another. There is no interpretation here. There is only the statute. He looked at Omar, who was conferring urgently with her counsel in the front row. The visual evidence was overwhelming. It wasn't a matter of opinion, it was a matter of dates and signatures. Shapiro pressed the attack. He argued that this tax fraud was the tell. It proved that the marriage to Elmi was a paper fiction, so irrelevant to her daily life that she didn't even bother to file taxes with him. Yet so legally binding that she couldn't marry the man she was actually living with. But he was not done. He had saved the darkest, most radioactive allegation for last. The brother question. Shapiro approached this with a calculated delicacy, framing it not as an assertion, but as an unanswered question that the public had a right to resolve. He spoke of the investigative reporting that had emerged from conservative outlets and Somali community forums. He spoke of the genealogical records from Somalia that listed Ahmed Nur Said Elmi's father as Nur Said Elmi, the same name as Ilhan Omar's father. He spoke of the sibling preference in immigration law, a process that takes 15 years. A spousal visa takes one. The allegation, Shapiro said, measuring his words, is that you didn't just commit immigration fraud. It is that you married your biological brother to defraud the United States government. A gasp, audible and sharp, rippled through the 2,000 people in the hall. Omar jumped in, her voice shaking with indignation. She called the question disgusting, absurd, and rooted in deep Islamophobia. She accused Shapiro of trafficking in the lowest form of internet conspiracy theories, of invading her family's privacy for sport. Shapiro stood his ground, unmoved by the emotional outburst. He argued that privacy ended when she filled out federal immigration forms. He argued that privacy ended when she became a public official. And then, he played his ace. You call it a conspiracy theory. Shapiro countered, his voice cutting through her protestations. You say it is absurd. You say it is false. Good, then end it tonight. He reached into the folder and pulled out a small, sealed plastic kit. He held it up to the light. It was a standard DNA collection kit. This is a cheek swab, Shapiro said. It costs $99. It takes 30 seconds to administer. It takes 48 hours to process. He placed the kit on the edge of his podium, pushing it slightly toward her side of the stage. If Ahmed Nur Said Elmi is not your brother, Shapiro continued, science will prove it. Biology does not lie. DNA does not care about politics. It does not care about Islamophobia. If you are unrelated, the test will show it. And I will apologize to you on national television. I will donate $50,000 to your campaign. I will admit I was wrong. He paused, letting the offer hang there. But you won't take the test, will you? He turned to the audience, outlining the psychology of the innocent. An innocent person, accused of something as heinous as incestuous marriage fraud, would be desperate to clear their name. They would view a DNA test not as an invasion, but as a weapon of vindication. They would take the test on live TV just to spike the football. The fact that you refuse, Shapiro said, his eyes locking onto hers, is the most damning evidence of all. You are betting that the media will call me a bigot for asking the question, rather than asking you for the answer. You are hiding behind a shield of outrage because you cannot stand behind a shield of truth. He returned to the timeline on the screen. He pointed to the documents, the marriage license, the divorce decree, the tax returns. We know you committed tax fraud, he summarized, ticking off the points on his fingers. The documents prove it. We know you committed immigration fraud, because you married a man you didn't live with. And now, we are left to wonder why. Why marry Elmi? Why take the risk? Unless the why is the one thing you are too afraid to prove false. Omar remained frozen. Her lawyer was practically standing now, signaling for the moderator to intervene, to move the debate along, to stop the bleeding. But the damage was done. The image of the refused DNA test sat on the stage, a physical symbol of the secrets locked away in the fourth folder. Shapiro closed the file, the sound sharp and final. He didn't need a confession. In the court of public opinion, the refusal to provide exonerating evidence when it was so easily available was a verdict in itself. The moderator, sensing the volatility of the room, awkwardly tried to transition to the next segment. But the audience was buzzing. They weren't looking at the moderator. They were looking at the DNA kit sitting on the podium. And they were looking at the congresswoman who wouldn't touch it. The silence of the evidence was deafening. Shapiro cleared the space on his podium, moving the heavy file of marriage records to the completed stack, and prepared to open the fifth and final folder, the one that would strip away the excuses and look at the ruins of Minneapolis. The auditorium was a pressure cooker, the air thick with the residue of unaddressed accusations. The marriage folder lay on the growing stack of discarded defenses, a silent monument to the unanswered DNA challenge. Ben Shapiro did not give the audience a moment to recover. He did not let the tension dissipate. He simply moved his hand to the fifth and final folder. Unlike the others, which had been thick with financial records or legal filings, this folder was conspicuously thin. It held only a few sheets of paper. Shapiro lifted it with 2 fingers. displaying its lack of heft to the cameras. The label was simple, almost ironic in its brevity: accomplishments. Shapiro walked to the center of the stage, abandoning the podium for the first time, removing the physical barrier between himself and the voters. He held the folder up. This, he announced, was the sum total of Congresswoman Omar's legislative career. 5 years in Washington, millions of dollars raised, countless cable news appearances, and this was the result. He signaled the control booth. The complex timelines and legal documents on the overhead screens vanished. The screen went pitch black for a dramatic second, then illuminated with a single, colossal digit in stark white font. 0. Shapiro stood beneath the number, letting its emptiness fill the room. He spoke with a quiet, devastating clarity. This was the number of bills sponsored by Ilhan Omar that had been signed into law during her entire tenure in the United States Congress. 0. Not one. In nearly 5 years of service, she had failed to author a single piece of legislation that crossed the finish line to become federal law. Omar attempted to break the silence, her voice rising with practiced indignation. She spoke of structural barriers, of Republican obstruction, of the difficulty of passing progressive legislation in a corporate-controlled system. She listed the bills she had introduced: bills to cancel rent, bills to declare housing a human right, bills to sanction foreign regimes. Shapiro cut through the noise with a simple gesture to the screen. He argued that introduction is not accomplishment. Anyone can write a bill. A legislator passes them. He dismantled her excuse of obstruction by bringing up the receipts of her peers. A new graphic appeared, comparing her record to her fellow Minnesota Democrats. Representative Dean Phillips, 6 bills signed into law. Representative Angie Craig, 4 bills signed into law. Shapiro pointed to the names. These were her colleagues. They represented the same state. They faced the same Republicans. They worked in the same polarized environment. Yet, they had managed to negotiate, to compromise, to find common ground on issues like veteran health care and small business relief. They had done the boring, unglamorous work of governance. Omar, by contrast, had done the work of a social media influencer. He characterized her tenure not as public service, but as performance art. He described a cycle where she would introduce a bill she knew had zero chance of passing, a message bill, solely to generate headlines, fire up her email list, and raise money from donors in California and New York. She was selling hope to the desperate while delivering absolutely nothing to the needy. She was, in Shapiro's formulation, the Congresswoman of Twitter, while her district needed a Congresswoman in the House. And then, the pivot. Shapiro turned his back on the 0 and faced the audience. If her lack of legislative success was a sin of omission, he argued, her impact on her own city was a sin of commission. He moved the discussion from the abstract halls of Washington to the concrete, bloodied streets of Minneapolis. The folder on the podium was replaced by a new set of images on the screen. The date: May 2020. The location: Minneapolis, 5th District. Shapiro took the audience back to the days following the murder of George Floyd. He acknowledged the tragedy, the legitimate anger, the need for justice, but then he overlaid that pain with Omar's political response. He displayed the tweets where she called for the dismantling of the Minneapolis Police Department. He quoted her description of the force as rotten to the root. He played the clips of her standing with activists who were not calling for reform, but for abolition. Then came the consequences. Shapiro warned the audience that the data he was about to show was not political spin. It was the FBI's Uniform Crime Report. It was the body count of a policy failure. The red line on the graph spiked vertically. Murders up 83%. Carjackings doubling. Assaults skyrocketing. Shapiro traced the line with his finger. He described the Ferguson effect on steroids. He spoke of the mass exodus of officers from the MPD, hundreds of badges turned in. Retirements accelerated, a force hollowed out by morale collapse and political demonization. He described the new reality of the 5th District, 911 calls ringing unanswered for minutes. Response times for priority calls stretching to terrifying lengths. Citizens left to fend for themselves in a city where the social contract had been shredded. He asked Omar directly, when she called for the dismantling of the police, Who did she think would answer the phone when a woman was being beaten? Who did she think would investigate the drive-by shootings that were now claiming the lives of children in North Minneapolis? Omar retorted that the violence was the result of root causes: poverty, systemic racism, lack of investment. She argued that police do not prevent crime, resources do. Shapiro was ready for the sociology lecture. He countered that poverty did not appear overnight in June 2020. Systemic racism did not suddenly spike in July. The variable that changed was the withdrawal of law enforcement, a withdrawal she had championed. He argued that her root causes theory was a luxury belief held by wealthy progressives who lived in safe, gated communities, while the working-class minorities she claimed to represent were paying the price in blood. To illustrate this, he moved from statistics to storytelling. He pulled a single sheet of paper from the thin folder. It was a profile of a man named Ahmed. Shapiro told the story of Ahmed's grocery on East Lake Street. He described Ahmed's journey, a Somali refugee. Just like Omar, who had come to America with nothing. He had worked double shifts, saved every penny, and built a business. He was the pillar of his block. He provided food to his neighbors. He was the American dream personified. Then came the riots. Shapiro described the night Ahmed watched his life's work burn. The glass shattering, the looters streaming in, the fire that consumed the structure. He described Ahmed calling 911, only to be told that no one was coming. The fire department couldn't enter the zone because the police couldn't secure it. Shapiro looked at Omar, his voice trembling with a controlled fury. He noted that Ahmed had no insurance for civil unrest. He lost everything. And where was his congresswoman? She was on cable news, rationalizing the riots as uprisings, describing the destruction as the language of the unheard. Shapiro asked if Ahmed's livelihood was just collateral damage in her revolution. He noted that Ahmed had eventually sold the charred lot at a loss and moved his family out of Minneapolis. He had fled the civil war in Somalia only to flee the lawlessness of Ilhan Omar's district. The room was deadly quiet. The story of Ahmed cut through the ideological noise, grounding the debate in a reality that everyone in Minneapolis understood. But Shapiro had one final blow to deliver on this front, a political rejection that proved Omar was out of step with her own voters. He brought up the 2021 ballot measure. This was the referendum to formally abolish the police department and replace it with a Department of Public Safety, the exact policy Omar had advocated for. It was put to a vote. The people of Minneapolis, the very people who had lived through the trauma of George Floyd and the riots, had their say. The screen displayed the result. Rejected. 56% to 44%. But Shapiro dug deeper. He showed a map of the vote. He pointed to North Minneapolis, the blackest, poorest, and most crime-ridden part of the city. The map was a sea of opposition. The very people Omar claimed to speak for, the marginalized, the victims of systemic racism, had voted overwhelmingly to keep the police. They didn't want abolition, they wanted safety. They wanted reform, not a vacuum. Shapiro turned to Omar with a look of pitiless scrutiny. He argued that this vote was the ultimate indictment. It proved that she was not representing the interests of her constituents. She was imposing the ideology of her white, progressive donors onto a black community that knew better. He accused her of ideological colonialism, of using the suffering of her district as a backdrop for her national celebrity. You speak for the faculty lounges of Oberlin and the donor dinners in San Francisco, Shapiro declared, his voice echoing to the rafters. You do not speak for the grandmother in North Minneapolis who is afraid to walk to the bus stop. She voted against you. She voted for the police. And yet, you continue to push policies that endanger her life to satisfy your brand. He closed the thin accomplishments folder and placed it on top of the others. The visual was striking. A stack of folders detailing scandals, fraud, and bigotry, capped by a folder containing absolutely nothing of substance. Shapiro summarized the ledger of failure. 0 bills passed, a city set on fire, a police force decimated, a business corridor ruined, a constituency ignored. He asked the audience, and the congresswoman, a final question that bridged the gap between her celebrity and her job performance. If you worked at a McDonald's, Shapiro posited, and you didn't serve a single burger for 5 years, But you burned down the kitchen and insulted the customers. You wouldn't be a celebrity. You would be fired. Why should the standard for a United States congresswoman be lower than the standard for a fry cook? The analogy landed with the weight of a sledgehammer. Omar stood silent, her talking points about justice and equity rendered hollow by the specificity of the attack. The zero on the screen seemed to burn into the retina of the audience. A symbol of a tenure defined by noise rather than signal. Shapiro stepped back, the prosecution of her record complete, ready to move to the final phase, the closing argument that would bind the financial, the moral, and the legislative failures into a single, undeniable verdict. The zero on the overhead screen finally faded, replaced by the stark, unforgiving house lights of the auditorium. The 5 manila folders, containing the evidence of financial impropriety, anti-Semitic rhetoric, terror minimization, marriage fraud, and legislative failure, sat in a neat, condemnatory stack on Ben Shapiro's podium. The forensic phase of the evening was over. The autopsy of Ilhan Omar's political career was complete. Now, it was time for the closing argument. The moment where the scattered pieces of evidence were assembled into a single, devastating narrative of betrayal. Shapiro did not return to the safety of his lectern. He remained center stage, pacing with the restless energy of a prosecutor who knows the jury is leaning forward, waiting for the final connection to be made. He addressed the audience not as spectators, but as victims of a long con. The question hanging in the air was simple. If her record was this catastrophic, if she had passed no laws, ignored her constituents, and enriched her family, how had she survived? How had she become one of the most famous, powerful, and well-funded politicians in the United States? Shapiro signaled for one last graphic. A map of the United States appeared on the screen. It was a heat map of campaign donations. The visual was a revelation. The 5th District of Minnesota, the frozen, hard-working expanse of Minneapolis and its suburbs, was a pale, barely visible speck. It contributed a negligible fraction of her war chest. But the coasts? The coasts were ablaze. Deep crimson splotches covered Los Angeles, San Francisco, Manhattan, and Washington, D.C. Shapiro walked to the map, gesturing to the glowing red centers of coastal wealth. He revealed the statistic that explained everything. Over 80% of Ilhan Omar's campaign funds came from outside the state of Minnesota. This, Shapiro argued, was the smoking gun of her political allegiance. She was not the representative of the 5th District. She was a mercenary for a national progressive aristocracy. Her constituents were not the Somali shopkeepers on Lake Street or the suburban moms in Edina. Her constituents were the radical faculty lounges of Berkeley, the gala attendees in Hollywood, and the activist class in Brooklyn. They paid for the show, and she delivered the performance. He deconstructed her entire political existence as a cynical business model. The cycle was simple, efficient, and lucrative. First, say something outrageous, minimize 9/11. Attack Israel, defund the police. Second, wait for the inevitable backlash from Republicans and moderate Democrats. Third, claim the mantle of victimhood, framing the criticism as an attack on her identity rather than her words. Fourth, send out emergency fundraising emails to that national list of coastal donors, crying persecution. Fifth, watch the millions roll in. Controversy, Shapiro posited, was not a mistake she made, it was the product she sold. Governance was boring. Passing bills required compromise, silence, and hard work. But controversy? Controversy made you a star. It got you magazine covers. It got you book deals. It got you speaking fees. And while she ascended to the heights of celebrity, Minneapolis burned. The zero legislative accomplishments were not a bug. They were a feature of a politician who had no interest in the job description. The auditorium was silent, the logic of the argument settling in like a heavy frost. Shapiro turned to Omar, offering her the floor for a final challenge. He stripped away the rules of engagement she was accustomed to. He forbade her from using the shield of identity. He forbade the vague platitudes of fighting for justice or raising awareness. He asked a single, piercing question. Tell these voters, right now, one specific thing you have done that has improved their lives. One road fixed, one grant secured, one law passed, one federal agency moved to action. Just one. The seconds that followed stretched into an eternity. The cameras zoomed in on Omar's face, searching for the defiance that had defined her career. It was gone. In its place was the panic of a student caught unprepared for the final exam. She opened her mouth to speak, but the practiced slogans died in her throat. She could not pivot to "fighting for the soul of America," because Shapiro had preemptively closed that exit. She had to name a deliverable. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. The silence was physical. It was the sound of a brand collapsing. She finally stammered something about giving voice to the voiceless, about changing the conversation. Shapiro didn't need to interrupt. The non-answer resonated louder than any heckle. Changing the conversation, he noted with a sad smile, did not lower the crime rate. Giving voice did not rebuild the businesses on Lake Street. The mask had slipped. There was no substance beneath the slogan. The moderator, sensing the total deflation of the event, called for closing statements. Omar went first. She had 5 minutes to salvage her career. She retreated to the only high ground she had left, the abstract. She spoke with passion, her voice rising and falling in the cadence of a revival preacher. She spoke of the forces of hate arrayed against her. She spoke of the historic nature of her representation. She spoke of a world where diversity was strength and resistance was duty. She painted Shapiro as an agent of the old guard, a bully seeking to silence a woman of color. It was a powerful speech. In a vacuum, it might have worked, but it was not in a vacuum. It was in a room where 5 manila folders sat on a podium, effectively rebutting every word she said. She spoke of integrity while the tax fraud documents lay a few feet away. She spoke of love while the anti-Semitic tweets were burned into the audience's memory. She spoke of community while the crime stats of Minneapolis cast a long shadow. Her rhetoric, once soaring, now sounded tinny and disconnected, a soundtrack to a movie that had already ended. Then, it was Shapiro's turn. He did not raise his voice. He did not pace. He stood behind his podium, his hands resting on the stack of evidence. He looked directly into the camera, breaking the fourth wall, addressing the voters watching at home. He began his summation like a coroner reading a cause of death. He did not use adjectives, he used nouns. Folder 1. The money. $2.8 million to a husband's firm. A campaign treated as a personal piggy bank. Folder 2. The hate. A pattern of anti-Semitism so toxic it drew condemnation from Nancy Pelosi and resulted in expulsion from the Foreign Affairs Committee. Folder 3. The betrayal. The minimization of 9/11. The moral equivalence between the U.S. military and the Taliban. The insult to the memory of James Cartier. Folder 4. The fraud. The tax returns filed jointly with one man while married to another. The refusal to take a simple DNA test to disprove the most heinous allegation of all. Folder 5. The failure. 0 bills passed. A city less safe. A constituency ignored in favor of national fame. He paused, letting the weight of the list settle. He offered the voters of the 5th District a binary choice. They could choose the symbol, the celebrity, the brand. They could choose to be represented by a national lightning rod who used their district as a stage for her personal melodrama. Or, they could choose reality. He leaned into the microphone for the final line, the catchphrase that had defined his career, but which tonight felt less like a slogan and more like a verdict. You can vote for the narrative, Shapiro said, his eyes hard and unyielding. You can vote for the identity. You can vote for the feelings. But tonight, you have seen the documents. You have seen the numbers. You have seen the truth. He closed the final folder, placing it atop the stack with a definitive thud. And facts, he concluded, the auditorium so quiet one could hear the hum of the ventilation. Don't care about your feelings. The moderator ended the debate. But nobody moved. The applause that eventually started was not the raucous cheering of a partisan rally, it was the stunned, murmuring applause of a crowd that had witnessed a dismantling. Omar gathered her papers quickly, her movements sharp and agitated, bypassing the post-debate handshakes, exiting the stage with her lawyers flanking her like a Praetorian guard protecting a fallen emperor. Shapiro remained for a moment, organizing his files, his expression unreadable. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He simply packed up the evidence of Ilhan Omar's record, closed his briefcase, and walked off stage right The cameras lingered on the empty podium, where the ghost of the evening's interrogation still hovered. The debate was over, but the reckoning had just begun. The facts had been unleashed into the ecosystem of Minnesota politics. And unlike the feelings they displaced, they would not simply fade away when the lights went down. The digital fallout began before the physical echo of the applause had faded from the auditorium. The debate did not end when the cameras cut, it metastasized. Within the first hour, the clip of Ilhan Omar standing silent before the DNA kit had been viewed 4 million times. By midnight, the hashtag Shapiro destroys Omar was the #1 trending topic globally, eclipsing sports scores and celebrity gossip. But this was not the usual partisan skirmish where both sides retreat to their corners claiming victory. The nature of the footage, the stark, undeniable visuals of the tax returns, the zero graphic, and the photo of James Cartier resisted spin. The internet, usually a fractured landscape of competing realities, was forced to converge on a single, uncomfortable truth. The congresswoman had been unable to answer basic questions about her record. Omar's communications team scrambled to deploy the standard countermeasures. At 11:45 p.m., a press release was issued, framing the evening not as a debate but as an ambush. The statement bristled with keywords: misogyny, Islamophobia, far-right agitation, bad faith. It accused Shapiro of bullying a woman of color and weaponizing trauma. In 2018, or perhaps even 2020, this defense might have held the line. But in the harsh light of the post-debate reality, the statement read like desperation. The counter-narrative collapsed because Shapiro had anticipated it. He had explicitly warned the audience that she would pivot to identity when she couldn't defend the facts. By issuing the statement, her team walked directly into the final trap he had set, confirming his closing argument that she viewed herself as a symbol above scrutiny rather than a public servant subject to it. The media reaction was a study in cognitive dissonance. Conservative outlets were jubilant, treating the debate as the greatest gladiatorial victory in modern political history. They played the "some people did something" confrontation on a loop. However, the true damage was inflicted by the silence of her usual defenders. Mainstream liberal outlets, typically quick to rally around the squad, found themselves paralyzed. There was no way to fact-check the zero bills passed. It was a matter of public record. There was no way to contextualize the tax fraud. The documents were IRS forms. Editorial boards at the New York Times and the Washington Post conspicuously avoided the topic, leaving a vacuum that was filled by local Minnesota reporting. And it was in Minnesota where the ground truly began to shift. The Star Tribune, the paper of record for the Twin Cities, published a scathing editorial 3 days later. It did not endorse Shapiro, but it validated his premise. The editors argued that while Shapiro's style was aggressive, the questions regarding the E Street Group payments and the refusal to address the marriage allegations were legitimate inquiries that the 5th District deserved answers to. For the first time, the local press stopped treating Omar as a national celebrity and started treating her as a local liability. The political consequences materialized with the speed of a collapsing stock. Internal polling conducted by Democratic operatives in the weeks following the debate showed a catastrophic erosion of Omar's base. The coalition that had carried her to victory, a mix of white progressives, young students, and the Somali community, fractured. The Jewish vote, understandably, had evaporated entirely. But the most shocking data came from North Minneapolis. The older black voters, the ones living closest to the crime wave Shapiro had highlighted, were peeling away. They had seen the debate clips not on Twitter, but on the local news. They saw the graph of the murder rate. They saw the zero accomplishments. They saw a politician who seemed more interested in fighting Ben Shapiro than fighting for their safety. Sensing blood in the water, the political sharks began to circle. Don Samuels, the veteran civil rights organizer and former city council member who had come within 2 points of unseating Omar in 2022, officially announced his rematch. But this was a different Don Samuels. In 2022, he was an underfunded challenger running on a "refund the police" platform. In 2024, he was the vessel for the district's buyer's remorse. He didn't need to run attack ads, he just ran the debate clips. His campaign spots were simple. A split screen showing Omar unable to name a single accomplishment on one side, and footage of Samuels working in the community on the other. The tagline was devastating in its simplicity: representation, not drama. The fundraising dynamic inverted. The Benjamins that Omar had once mocked now turned against her. Traditional Democratic donors, the pro-Israel lobby, and even labor unions that were tired of the defund rhetoric quietly shifted their resources. They didn't want a Republican, the district was too blue for that. They wanted a functional Democrat. Money poured into the Samuels campaign, allowing him to match Omar on the airwaves for the first time. Omar fought back with the ferocity of a cornered incumbent. She rallied the National Progressive Cavalry. Senator Bernie Sanders flew in for a rally. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez posted viral videos defending her sister in the struggle. They tried to nationalize the race again, painting Samuels as a puppet of IPAC and Republican interests. But the spell was broken. Every time Omar spoke about a national movement, voters remembered Shapiro's map showing her out-of-state funding. Every time she spoke of justice, voters remembered the image of James Cartier. The debate had implanted a skepticism that no celebrity endorsement could dislodge. August 2024 arrived, humid and tense. Election day in Minneapolis felt less like a primary and more like a referendum on the era of performative politics. Turnout was historically high. As the returns trickled in, the story became clear. The suburbs of Edina and St. Louis Park broke heavily for Samuels. The Jewish community turned out in force. But the decisive blow came from the city itself. The precincts in North Minneapolis, the ones that had rejected the defund amendment, delivered a crushing verdict against the incumbent. At 10:15 p.m., the Associated Press called the race. Don Samuels, 53.5%. Ilhan Omar, 46.5%. It wasn't a landslide, but for an incumbent with global name recognition and a multi-million-dollar war chest, it was a humiliation. The 7-point margin was a decisive rejection. Omar's concession speech was held in a small, crowded Union Hall. The atmosphere was toxic with resentment. She did not congratulate her opponent. She did not accept responsibility. Instead, she doubled down on the narrative that Shapiro had dismantled. She railed against dark money, right-wing interference, and the corporate media. She claimed that her loss was a temporary setback in the long arc of justice. She left the stage without answering questions. Her career as a legislator ending exactly as it had begun, with a speech full of grievances and void of introspection. Across town, the scene at the Samuels headquarters was jubilant but focused. Don Samuels took the stage not as a conqueror, but as a public servant. He thanked the voters for choosing substance over slogans. He promised to be a congressman who would pick up the phone, who would write bills, and who would show up when the cameras weren't rolling. He didn't mention Ben Shapiro by name, but the ghost of the debate was in every word he spoke. The voters had chosen the boring work of governance over the intoxicating high of celebrity. Ben Shapiro, watching the results from his studio in Florida, did not gloat. He did not launch into a monologue about the crushing of the left. He simply opened Twitter and typed a final post to cap the saga. He attached a screenshot of the election results, the final repudiation of the E Street Group payments, the anti-Semitic tropes, the marriage scandals, and the legislative failures. The caption was 3 words. Facts 1. Finally. The tweet was liked 500,000 times within the hour. The legacy of the debate extended far beyond Minnesota's 5th district. It became a case study in political science courses. It marked the high watermark and the subsequent recession of the squad era of politics. It proved that while social media engagement and identity politics could shield a politician for a time, they were not impervious armor. Eventually, the ledger must balance. Eventually, the questions must be answered. Ilhan Omar retreated from the public eye, transitioning into the world of nonprofit activism and paid speaking engagements. A world where she could speak without being cross-examined, where she could preach without being asked for data. But the lesson remained. The night Ben Shapiro walked onto the stage at the University of Minnesota with 5 manila folders. He didn't just win a debate. He demonstrated that in the long run, reality is the only constituency that matters. The fog of rhetoric had lifted, and Minneapolis could finally see clearly again.